Silent Hill 2 is a legendary game regarded as not only the pinnacle of the franchise, but the pinnacle of survival horror altogether. And it boasts an ensemble cast of some of the most memorable, impacting, and dynamic characters the medium has ever seen. Except for this fucking guy who's capable of about as much synaptic activity as a kitchen table.
This video is about James
Sunderland.
At its very best, Silent Hill is a series brimming with characters riddled with heaps of dynamic and depth.
Get over here, you freak! Who do you think you are, walking around with them butt cheeks out like that?
Be it in their journey to find someone.
Have you seen a little girl around here? Short, black hair, 7 years old?
Their psychological torment, traumas, or just distorted and disordered mental states overall, every character in this series has something going on under the hood worth exploring and discussing. Which is insane when you consider the best game in the series is led by a character as dumb as a bag of milk. And while there are lots of interesting things about him and the massive role he plays in the story, very few of these things are apparent to someone playing the game for the first time. And for me personally, playing through the game knowing the full story, the sheer fucking buffoonery of his personality and choices are actually kind of a frustrating distraction from the tone of the universe he exists within. But before we get started, it is imperative for you to know that I adore this game. Silent Hill 2 is one of my favorite video games of all time, so any jokes I make at this game's expense are purely made out of love. I should also mention that I am playing through and reviewing every PS2 horror game ever released, as well as covering news and any other modern content that I feel like I have something to say about. So if any of that sounds good to you, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and undergoing such a treacherous task, I need all the help I can get. James Bummerland Sunderland returns to the town of Silent Hill, a tourist destination he and his wife visited once in the past, after being called there by what he believes to be his wife Mary, while in the throes of grief 3 days after Mary was killed by a terminal illness. A terminal illness known as James Sunderland. And I think the murder of Mary by James is one of the more interesting parts of his character, as well as pretty much everything we learn about him prior to his arrival in Silent Hill. And while I am definitely going to be taking more than a few swings at our man here, I do need to mention that there are plenty of things about him that I do find legitimate depth and interest in. Namely, the all too realistic human emotions that take place in the throes of dealing with his wife's illness, such as his conflicted feelings of both love and resentment, the fear of facing his wife's death, his sexual repression. All of this is a tremendously honest and unflinching look at the human condition. James's resentment and frustration towards Mary gains further depth when we find out Mary had actually been lashing out at James and pushing him away. But is it grounds for killing someone you love? Obviously not. For one, that's really fucked up. But for two, just give it some time, brother. She's gonna die anyway. All jokes aside, the feelings that envelop James in this part of his life really aren't that weird for someone whose life has been so suddenly uprooted, which is all the more true for someone who didn't have a lot of instability in their lives to cope with prior. Something true of both Mary and James, who seem to have lived pretty spirited existences prior to the illness. It took a lot of courage, care, and brilliance for Team Silent to pull this off, which they did with astounding grace. However, Sir Bummerland here got very little of that grace in his actual portrayal in the game itself. With the personality of a cankersaur and the elegance of a sledgehammer,
Angela, relax.
James just kind of exists, cantankerously making his way through the story, and while yeah, it's very interesting to watch him come to terms with his actions and face his delusions, the storytelling and world building is so incredible that you could sub him out for literally any other video game character and still come out crying at the end of the game. Replace James with fucking anyone, Sonic the Hedgehog, coping with the death of Dr. Robotnik, and it would be just as powerful. You know what, come to think of it, that would actually be pretty sick. Hey Siri, call Chris Chan. Even a child is more interesting than James, and children, as you may know, are scientifically, objectively uninteresting. And if you're a child watching this right now, you have Bad parents. Laura is an 8-year-old orphan who ends up in Silent Hill after catching a ride with Eddie in search of Mary, whom Laura shared a hospital room with in the final days of her illness. She doesn't seem to be aware of the monsters lurking around town, which most fans attribute to her being an innocent character who is most pure of heart, which, side note, I ain't buying. Laura may be an 8-year-old child, but she's also a fucking douchebag. She calls Eddie a gutless fatso, which, I mean, she's not exactly wrong, but he ain't exactly in the best headspace right now either, so yeah, maybe not the best move. Kicks a key away from James as he's desperately reaching for it before running off and laughing. She claims she's looking for Mary, but nearly every time we see her, she's just sitting around doing nothing while James does all the work. Meanwhile, Mary's body's been marinating in the backseat of the car from Driver for 3 days, doubtlessly stinking up the entire town, and Laura doesn't even bother to check. She tricks James into going inside a room only to lock him inside with flesh lips. Not malevolent spirited my ass, Laura is the primary antagonist of the game. Okay, I'm getting sidetracked. The way Laura and James interact is a great example of James's ineptitude and failure to handle conflict, which again, I suppose could be here on purpose and likely is, but situations like this make the guy really hard not to just feed to the monsters.
What's the magic word?
Laura?
Okay, I guess it won't open it.
You snotty little brat! Open up!
Dude, just say please. And what universe is open up, you snotty little brat, gonna help you here? And I mean, yeah, Laura tricked him and locked him inside and all, which, as I've already said, what a little shit. But he can't just bring himself to ever do anything right. Like, I have a really hard time believing this is how he was before Mary got sick. I understand losing his will to live and throwing caution to the wind and how he sticks his arms in places practically decorated with signs warning you to not put your fucking hands in here, but that's not what's happening here. He's begging for his life. Maybe you could make a case for this being another instance of metaphor or analogy, but I don't know, man. Dude's just fucking stupid. From a lore perspective, it's definitely interesting that his grief and guilt were so tremendously powerful he was able to conjure up a sentient person into Silent Hill in the form of Maria, but even his delusions of the perfect woman are weak, as Maria herself is barely more interesting and useful than James himself, just kind of bumbling around town in his shadow, offering little more than sexual advances to the greater narrative, and while I totally understand that is more or less her entire purpose, it just furthers to prove how limited in depth and imagination James is as a person, conjuring up his wife in the vision of Christina Aguilera, one of the most popular sex icons of the era, and in one of her least interesting outfits. Maria is a manifestation of James's guilt, denial, fear, sexual repression, which is kind of strange considering she looks more like a bemused librarian than a sex icon, but I'm not one to kink shame, and it does make sense because aside from the whole wife murder kink, he's a pretty straight-laced guy. This makes Maria a poltergeist of sorts, much like the enemies in the series, which I find incredibly cool. I mean, if dangerous enemies can be carved from the energy of one's fears and trauma, going so far as being able to inflict harm on said individual, it would stand to reason that one could also conjure a non-hostile individual that inflicts boners, no?
Is this your only special place?
Makes sense to me. And her sentience really is interesting because she contains Mary's memories and actually manifests not in front of James by the pier as it may have seemed, but in a nearby haunted house as shown in the Born from a Wish expansion, where she essentially pops into existence, does some puzzles, and helps a dead guy attempt to resurrect his daughter with Ernest is a weird guy. She has inherited much from James, including his suicidal tendencies, horrible critical thinking skills illustrated best by seeing this room as a nice place to have a lie down, would rather hang out with this guy than be alone, and instead of asking James to set her free from a prison cell because, like, she's in a prison cell, she instead comes on to James and uses sex to try to get him to open the door. But what's worse is it fucking works!
Come and get me. I can't do anything through these bars.
Okay, stay right there.
This is it, Beavis. We're finally gonna score. Thank God.
But I gotta hand it to Boy here with a choker like this and a tattoo like that. Contrast all of this to who I think might be the most dynamic and incredible character in the game, Angela. It's easy for me to pick on Maria and James for being dopes. It's fun punching down on Laura for being a fucking asshole. Get back here! But with Angela, honestly, man, the trauma and horror she has had to face to reach the state we find her in goes way deeper and is more horrifying than almost anything I've seen in a video game, save for maybe Rule of Rose. Angela is a woman who winds up in Silent Hill after taking the lives of her father and brother after years of being the victim of their unspeakable abuses, and is looking for her mother, who she believes to be somewhere within the town. While her mother was also abusive in her own way, telling Angela she deserved it and essentially existing to push salt into the wounds left by the men in her family, she manages to leave the family home sometime in Angela's youth. While it would be easy to point at Angela as just being crazy, what with the baby talk manifesting and referring to her parents as mama and daddy, her suicidal tendencies, being constantly paranoid of and hostile towards James, I don't actually think Angela is the least bit crazy. I see Angela as an incredibly accurate representation of a lifelong victim of trauma and familial abuse, especially in the way she interacts with James, pulling away anytime he comes near her, always expecting him to cause her harm, and while her ending may seem sad in that she essentially kills herself, I think it's done in a way that gives her autonomy, and I see her death more as a freedom than a tragedy. And while yeah, I mean, she's technically a murderer and she's obviously haunted by it, I mean, she killed her father and brother who had been sexually, physically, and psychologically abusing her for years, so fuck them. That turtleneck, on the other hand, is definitely something to feel shame for.
You gonna go in town, you go to Bloomingdale's, you find yourself some nice dresses, get yourself some shoes, you know, find somewhere maybe you get a facial, because damn.
As for how James interacts with such a brilliantly illustrated character, for all his failings, he is essentially a pretty nice dude, and we get to see a lot of that in him with his more gentle interactions with Angela. But man, does he manage to just projectile diarrhea shit the bed here sometimes too. For instance, at one point when he meets up with Angela, she is laying on the ground talking about killing herself, and when she implies that James is also running away from his problems, he tells a person currently considering suicide who just said that she deserves to die, "I'm not like you." Imagine othering someone contemplating suicide. Mary, how is this your man? He does manage to snap back into some sense of self-awareness in this scene with Angela when he tells her, "She's dead, I don't know why I'm here, but don't worry, I'm not crazy." Eddie is my dude. I love Eddie. I mean, I fucking hate Eddie, but like you gotta love Eddie. Eddie is definitely the lowest rung of all the characters here in terms of
killing a person ain't no big deal.
Basically everything. And while there are two characters who have taken the life of another human, or in the case of Angela, multiple humans, Eddie's story is the only one that feels truly insane, which is really interesting because he hasn't actually killed any humans as far as we know, but he did kill a dog, and as we all know, dogs are much better people than people, so if this video was ranking every Silent Hill character on mental illness, yeah, Eddie's got the number one on that one for sure. Eddie's young life has been a pretty shit existence, all things considered, being bullied and tormented his whole life through for being overweight, and instead of choosing the path of, I don't know, not eating pizza when there are monsters around and a little girl is outside alone, you essentially doubled down on the worst parts of himself, blaming the genetic lottery for his appearance, becoming the proto 4chan galoof we all know today. But while he is about as hateable as it gets in many ways, I think he brings an admittedly ironic sense of weightlessness and humor to the game that I felt like it really needed around the time he shows up. And be it in his toddler-ass outfit or in Celic demeanor, I just feel like there's something about him I find really interesting and almost endearing, even if he is a monolithic piece of shit with the personality of a school shooter who hangs out with a little girl like a dark timeline Johnny Bravo. Eddie arrives in Silent Hill after snapping one day and shooting a longtime bully in the knee before proceeding to murder the guy's dog, a memory he seems to revel in when speaking of it, showing off Eddie's true cowardice, not able to mortally wound someone he feels is an actual threat, and rather deciding to murder the dog instead. Classic weak school shooter ass behavior. Honestly though, the real proof that Eddie is the crazy craziest character in the game is his decision to wear white horizontal stripes on a shirt that doesn't fit him while being self-conscious about his looks and his weight. Easily the most masochistic choice any character makes in this game. Why are you wearing horizontal stripes? James is pretty nice to Eddie in most of their interactions, a little concerned and alarmed here and there, but overall these two are neither enemies nor exactly friends, just a couple of guys being dudes. That is until James stumbles into Eddie's other world where he delivers this little manifesto of sorts. And as pathetic and unhinged as this diatribe of shit is, James once again manages to one-up the craziest motherfucker in the game with sheer stupidity when he asks an insecure, insane person who's holding a gun at him if he's gone nuts.
Eddie, have you gone nuts?
I don't know what United States Police Department taught this guy de-escalation strategies, but they're not working. Which, of course, ends in a boss fight with Eddie, resulting in James's body count raising to 2, something James laments, and it ends up reminding him of Mary, but for a single moment, in a moment of real tenderness and intrigue, leading us to finally begin seeing the shell of James break and an actual character begin to emerge. This emergence becomes complete in the final level at the Lakeview Hotel, where James watches the videotape he left behind while on vacation here with Mary some years ago. This reveals that he killed Mary, and this is where he begins truly coping with what he's done. Now, I know this video hasn't been especially kind to James, but he is the foundation the game is built on, and the reason it's so structurally sound is all predicated on the way that the story unfolds in the final chapter, where he blossoms from a despondent dunce to something of a hero in his own right. My favorite narrative device that is often used in Silent Hill games is the idea of facing one's own demons. My personal favorite example of this is definitely Travis Grady's story in Silent Hill Origins, which I've made a video on in the past and remains the best video I've ever made. If you haven't seen it, you're f***ing up. I peaked super early in this channel's short life. When James finally begins remembering his past and facing it, we get my personal favorite boss of the game, which is against Mary, or Maria depending on your ending. And this is where some of my own conjecture and inference comes in, because these games are all, at the end of the day, about interpretation. And while Masahiro Ito does give us a bit of an objective lore, telling us it's representing James' conflicted emotions towards Mary during his final days, that does still leave us with quite a bit to interpret on our own. This fight means a lot of things to a lot of different people, and while I do believe most of them have quite a bit of truth to them, my personal favorite take on this fight is James fighting off Maria from his mind and no longer needing a proxy with which to remember Mary or to see her differently than she was in her dying days. And I think that's beautiful. James really does redeem himself come the end of the game, but I just can't shake the personal want for him to have gotten here in a slightly different way. The remake will be out soon, so make sure to leave all the comments about this aging like milk if these issues remain therein, but that's personally what I want to see. I want to not have to only like or tolerate the main character in the final hour of the game, and I think there's an incredible amount of possibilities they could go with to smooth this out a little bit. Because if anything makes the original feel aged, honestly, I think it's James, and if the remake doesn't tweak his personality a bit to make him feel a little bit more interesting and not so stiff, I worry how it's going to perform to modern audiences. But who knows, I'm probably wrong about that. Resident Evil 7 and 8 have a particularly weak lead character, and they sold very well, are beloved, and even I loved the shit out of those games. So who knows, I guess we're going to have to wait and see. And that's not to say he needs to be quippy or some annoying character. Like, I just anything other than being boring and unlikable, I would love to see. And I have no problem with characters being unlikable. Abby is my favorite character in The Last of Us, just to give you an idea of how little a problem I have with unlikable characters. But this is not unlikable in that way. I just think James sucks. Stupid. But what do you guys think? Is James a perfectly fine character just the way he is? Are my Silent Hill opinions awful? What are some other games that you would like to see me cover, PS2, PS1, or anything horror related in general? As always, let me know know in the comments right after you like and subscribe. Huge shout out to my Patreon supporters, Sockray Blue and Mr. Nobody, as well as my YouTube subscription members, Racoon Peddler and Kil13r Jay. Thank you all so much, and I'll smell you later.